ladies and gents. So the title of the lecture this afternoon is Britain in 2018 a Fair Society? And I'm going to draw into it sort of elements of sociology, which I teach alongside history, but hopefully you'll find elements of it that are relevant to all of your studies. Even those of you that do sociology, you should see some relevance and a lot of things here that are new to you, okay? I'm going to start off with something quite topical, so I'm going to show you a little bit of Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn facing off at PMQs, and then I'll explain the relevance of that.
I'm very interested that the right honourable gentleman has found that his appearances at Prime Minister's Questions have been going so well. He's had to borrow a question from the leader of the Liberal Democrats, which he asked me last week. Perhaps the leader of the opposition should pay a little more attention to what happens in Prime Minister's Questions.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to Brexit, this government is a shambles.
Many members are gesticulating on both sides of the House in a frenetic and frankly outlandish fashion. Or did I say to the honourable gentleman member for Helion and Yar, he should seek to imitate the Zen-like calm and statesmanship of the father of the House, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
So I wanted to introduce you to that. So you can see obviously there's quite a lot of acrimonious debate between Corbyn and May in the House of Commons. But one thing that they do agree on is the idea that Britain should be a fairer society, okay? So you've got a quote from Theresa May here talking about the Brexit referendum and saying that she thinks that it will lead to a stronger, fairer Britain that works for everyone, okay? Corbyn, again, is a big advocate of a fair society. Where they perhaps differ is that he would want to create a more equal society, okay? So we're going to think about those two concepts, fairness and equality. First thing I'd like to do is just think about that question on the board. So do we live in an equal society today? Corbyn's all for moving towards equality. So if you just put your hand up, guys, ladies and gents, if you think we live in an equal society today. So the record will show that nobody's got their hand up. Now what about a fair society? That's a slightly different thing. Hands up if you think we live in a fair society today. I see a few hands creeping up there. So what's the difference between those two things? What's the difference between an equal society and a fair society?
Equal would mean that everyone has the same, whereas fairness is more about opportunities that people have.
Yeah, excellent, okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you today, ladies and gents, like various sociologists that have had differing things to say about fairness within society and equality in society. And the first group I'm going to introduce you to are what are called functionalist sociologists, okay? So functionalism was a sociological perspective that emerged in America in the 1940s and 1950s. And it very much agreed with some of you. It said society wasn't equal, but that was fair. It was fair that there should be inequality in society, okay? And we're going to look at the work of two sociologists, so Kingsley Davis and Wilbur Moore, and they were into this idea of meritocracy. So when we think about functionalism and their point of view, we've got to think about the kind of context first of all. So these are American thinkers, and they're working in America after the Second World War. So this is the period where America's just demolished Nazism, where it's winning the Cold War, and where there's a huge amount of confidence in America about it being the kind of the home of freedom and the home of opportunity. So their idea was that within society, it was right there should be inequality. It was right that society should be stratified. Okay, they use this idea that some people should be the top strata, some people should be underneath, some people should be underneath that. There should be different levels of society. Okay, so long as it was fair, and some people are going to rise to the top of society. They're going to be in that top strata, and then we're going to be able to be paid more as a result. And this was the idea of the American dream. If you work hard, you're going to succeed. You're going to thrive. You're going to rise to the top. And that's fair, that's the way society should be. And this is something that Theresa May is into herself, isn't she? She's into the idea of meritocracy, okay, and the idea that everyone should have equal opportunities. This was why she was quite into the idea of grammar schools, the idea that at 11 everyone should have an opportunity to do a test of deciding whether you should go to the top or the bottom of the education system. Mr. Christo.
So just to ask a question, I think we can understand equality, that can be measured, but fairness, how would we define fairness? I'm not clear how fairness can be defined in this context.
Yeah, I mean, do feel free to jump in with questions at any point. I mean, I guess I don't have an answer. Would anyone like to sort of jump in with a definition of what, how do you think we define fairness? Go on, Ellie.
Would you define fairness as more equality of opportunity rather than just equality in general?
Yeah, I think certainly functionalists would do. They would say it's to do with equality of opportunity. We're going to see there are other people that would very much debate that idea of whether there actually can be equality of opportunity. So I think it's a good question to throw out there, Mr. Christo, and I suppose how you define fairness will lead to how you define a fair society. If you've got any questions, guys, at any point, do put your hand up and feel free to kind of chip in. Okay? So we've got this idea of meritocracy developed by the original functionalists. Okay? And as I say, this is something that May herself is quite into. This is a big part of what she wants to create in her fair society. Now, another functionalist sociologist came along, a man called Talcott Parsons. Again, he was working in America in the 1950s, and he developed this idea of kind of stratification and society into what he called the organic analogy. So he said basically, rather than thinking about society as levels, we should think about the different parts of society as like the organs of the human body. Okay? So like in your body, you have different organs, the heart, the brains, the gallbladder, the liver, and these things all need to work together. We should think about society in the same kind of way. And he said you need certain people to be at the top to be like the brains of society. Okay, so Oliver here might go on to become a politician. He's the brains of society, he's leading society, and as such he should get rewarded more, he should be paid more, okay? Other people have got to be like the kind of muscles, the sinews of society, so people that are maybe less qualified that do the work. So Ariel here might be the muscles of society, okay? He might be working in construction or something like that, and he's not going to be as highly qualified, he's not going to be paid as well. Again, that's fair. And they applied that idea to gender as well, okay? They said it's right that certain people, men, are going to be, again, like those muscles of society, they're going to work, and women are going to be more like the kind of emotional side of society. They're going to be the heart of society, if you like. And they used this analogy, along with some pretty dodgy scientific research, to argue that it was important in the 1950s that women should stay at home and look after children, okay? And they even argued that if they didn't, those children might grow up to be maladjusted. There was this idea that, you know, people had different roles in society, and that was right because it was like the different organs of the body, and it could lead to different amounts of pay. I'm going to play you a little clip here, guys, which is going to lead into the next idea that comes off this, okay? So this is a clip from Little Britain. And this is their character, Vicky Pollard, and I'm going to use that to develop some of these functionalist ideas.
Now, she doesn't know why she's here yet, but please welcome Vicky Pollard. Hi, Vicky. Now, you don't actually know why you're here today, do you?
You, but, you're, but, you, but, you're, but. Is it because you're doing Teens in Trouble, right? Because I ain't never even done nothing or nothing. Because let me tell you the whole thing, right? Because Michelle Bingham, who's a complete bitch anyway, has been completely going around saying that I went into Shelley Thacker's bag and licked a bottle of Chinzano, but I never, but I did. But only because you're not actually supposed to have alcohol on school grounds, actually. And I was going to give it to Miss Turvey, but I forgot and drank it. And only got found out because I was getting off with that Steve Sharby and the language lab and I was sick in his mouth.
No, Vicky, that's not why you're here today.
Oh my God, you've been talking to Destiny Platt, haven't you? Because you know Destiny Platt, right?
No.
Yeah, but she ain't not even got nothing to do with it anyway, so just leave her out of it. God, stop getting involved, you God, I'm such a mixer. I know why I'm here. It's because you're doing I've Had Two Babies and I'm only 12. You are run out of order because I was 13 when I had my second child. Anyway, have you been talking to Aaron Peel? Because let me tell you about Aaron Peel, right? Because listen to this, Tricia.
No, just listen to me.
Tricia, just talk to your face because the hand ain't listening. Because Aaron Peel's like a total batty boy and he ain't got no pubes. And he's well out of order because he's been completely going around saying that I like smoke and drank when I was pregnant.
Right, guys, now the reason for playing that clip and tying it in with sociology is it ties in with an idea called the underclass. Okay, so we had another American sociologist, a man called Charles Murray came along, and he said that within society, within these strata, these levels, you had a new group emerging called the underclass at the bottom of society. And that character, the Little Britain character, Vicky Pollard's a kind of a spoof, a stereotype of an underclass character, okay? And Charles Murray said, again, this was a kind of meritocratic thing. There was this group at the base of society, and they deserved to be at the bottom of society. So a group of people that relied on, you know, benefits and crime, and they were there basically because they were lazy and because they were less intelligent than other members of society. So again, for Murray, this ties in with the idea of underclass, okay? And he said that we're going to find that, you know, these people at the bottom of society deserve to be there because their intelligence is lower than that of other people. And in fact, he said intelligence is the greatest kind of indicator of how well people do in society, more important than social class or anything like that, okay? And he in fact wrote a book called The Bell Curve, and he made some quite controversial claims in that, okay, about why the underclass deserve to be at the base of society. I'm going to read from that. So he said, poor people are born lazy. When we know the complete genetic story, it will turn out that the population below the poverty line in the United States has a configuration of the relevant genetic makeup that is significantly different from the configuration of the population above the line. This is almost certainly true, okay? So he's saying we've got this group emerging at the base of society, and they deserve to be at the bottom of society because they're lazy and because they're less intelligent. So they're quite extreme ideas, or at least I think they are. But they're important because this concept of the underclass is one that's been quite influential on our government and on the Republican government in America, okay? Now that's just to underline some of these functionalist arguments. I want to go back to that question again, and again, just hands up, see if we still got the same opinion. This idea, do we believe that Britain is a fair society? So again, hands up again, guys, if you still think it's a fair society, if more of you think it's a fair society, if less of you think it's a fair society. Good, right, so pretty much the same as before, maybe a little bit more. Now we're going to think here about the idea of equality, okay? This is called a Lorenz curve, okay? So this is an economic model. Is anyone kind of familiar with the Lorenz curve and what it represents? We've got a nod in the front here. Fit? Yeah, okay. Errol, I'll put you on the spot. What is it?
It's a measure of inequality in an economy. So that 45-degree line is perfect equality. So everybody has exactly the same, and 0 would be one person has everything, and so the curve represents how close.
Yeah. So the line of equality here, guys, would be if wealth was kind of equally shared. Okay, so if the poorest 20% of the population had 20% of the wealth, if the wealthiest 90% of the population had 90% of the wealth. Okay, when we actually look at how the money is distributed, it's distributed even more unequally than that. Okay, so the poorest segment of society own very little of the wealth. Okay, so to give you some statistics, guys. Okay, so the poorest 50% of British society owns only 9% of the wealth. The top 20% of society earns 7 times what the poorest 20% earn. So there's massive kind of inequality in there. Now again, guys, if we approach that from the meritocratic model, that's not a problem, is it? Because we'd say those people at the top, you know, the brains of society, they're the people that should be earning vastly more than the people at the bottom. There's things that tie to it as well. If we add in a kind of healthcare dimension to it, guys, and I know some of you, you know, have got plans to work in medicine and things like that, the bottom 20% of society on average lives 7 years shorter than the top 20%. The bottom 20% of society, I think the bottom 10%, have twice as high a level of infant mortality. So those are maybe things we might be a little bit less comfortable with, okay? But clearly, guys, we've got a sort of major inequality of wealth. Now to build on that model here, if we think about the population divided up into these 10 individuals here, the 2 red individuals are the bottom 20%, this is the next 20%, the middle 20%, this is the top 20%, and this is the highest 20%. If we look at American society today, guys, this is the actual distribution of wealth there. Okay, so it's even more extreme than in Britain. The top 20% in America own over 80% of the wealth. Okay, the next 20%, 11% of the wealth. Okay, and therefore the remaining kind of 5% is divided up amongst this 60% of society. So it's very unequal. Now again, you might argue, guys, that that's fair enough from a meritocratic model, but there's a difference between what the actual distribution is and what people think. So if you ask people in America what they think the distribution of wealth is, they think that the top 20% have about 60% of the wealth, okay? Whereas the reality is 85% of the wealth. If you ask them what people should have, most people in America said that they felt the top 20% should own about 30% of the wealth. So it's still unequal, but it's not a vast disparity. The next 20%, okay, should own 22% of the wealth, and so on. So you can see there's a real gap between what people think the distribution of wealth should be, which isn't completely equal, what it is, or sorry, what they want it to be, what they think it should be, what it actually is. Okay, it's far more unequal than people in general think it should be. Now again, what's the problem with that, guys? I'm going to show you a little clip. Okay, this is an experiment called the monkey fairness experiment. What they do is they've got 2 monkeys and they get them to do a task, and they're paying one with grapes, which is more desirable if you're a monkey apparently, and one with cucumber. And just going to have a look at that, guys, and look at the impact of it.
You will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task, and we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us, and that's what she does. And she gets a grape, and she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests a rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Okay, so we're going to move on to look at another kind of argument about equality and inequality, which links to that, okay? Does anyone recognise these 10 gentlemen? Anyone know who they are? Or any of them? I know a couple of them. Does anyone recognise this man here? He's a former Prime Minister. Yeah, David Cameron. This one here?
Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson, this is Boris Johnson, okay. This is a man called, I think, this is, sorry, Jonathan Ford, who's like one of the leading writers on the FT, okay. Up at the back we've got a guy called Ewan Ferguson, who's a major lawyer, okay. Does anyone know who this group are together?
Is it the Bullingdon Club?
It's the Bullingdon Club, yeah. Who are the Bullingdon Club?
It's like people who go to Oxford University and very rich people do.
Yeah, yeah. It's like a kind of dinner society at Oxford University, okay, made up of like exclusively of men. I don't know if they have to be former Etonians. Like I think most of these are former Etonians. I don't know. Do you know Mr. Christo? You remember, weren't you, back in the day?
I've forgotten.
So they tend to be people that come from like sort of Eton and top private schools, and they get together in this drinking club, and they're sort of well known for like bad behaviour at Oxford. Okay, so there's a story about how these 10 went out on the town and they kind of like went into a restaurant and wound up a massive bill, and then they trashed the restaurant. I think Ferguson here threw a flower plot through the window of a restaurant, and the police were called out with kind of sniffer dogs and all kind of people, and 6 out of the 10 were arrested at the time. Amy?
I think there's a film of it.
I think there is. Yeah.
It's really good.
Yeah, yeah. Does it sort of
They
like...
burn money in front of homeless people.
Yeah, I was going to say, did they come out of it positively?
No.
Probably no, not very positively, okay. So this ties in with an idea of a sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu. And he said that when we look at equality, it's not just about capital, it's not just about money. He said it's about what we call social capital. So it's not about how much you earn, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. Okay? And he said this was a massive inequality in society. Because if you look at these sort of 10 men here, we've got, haven't we, like Foreign Secretary, possible future Prime Minister, past Prime Minister, we've got leaders in terms of law, journalism, and there's this argument that all of these people are linked together, okay? And Bourdieu said that people who go to these top universities, who come from these top private schools like Eton, have got a massive advantage because they all know each other and they have this kind of social capital which is going to enable them to get on in life, okay? When you occasionally get emails from me with opportunities from organisations like the Sutton Trust, okay? They're organisations that's trying to break that by getting more kind of comprehensive school students, and particularly comprehensive school students from poor backgrounds, to go on to university, okay? Because if we look at public life, there's some quite sort of shocking statistics. So this is, you know, sort of leading public figures in Britain. We can see 330 of them educated in Eton College, Winchester College, and so forth, okay? So like a massive preponderance of these individuals. Obviously in government, we've mentioned, haven't we, Cameron, we've mentioned, you know, Boris Johnson. There's some other quite striking statistics, okay? So if you look at law, 63% of the top people in law are private school educated, okay? 60% of senior officers in the armed forces, 59% of leading figures in business. So there's the idea that, again, there's a massive domination of these groups by people that have gone to public schools, or private schools I should call them, okay, which is, what, about like 7-8% of the population? It's a very kind of small percentage of the population. Okay, and this ties in with what we call a Marxist interpretation, okay? So Pierre Bourdieu, who spoke about this capitalist, this organisation, this social capital, was a Marxist, okay, so he believed in equality. And he came up with a concept which he called the ideological state apparatus. And this is an idea that society is very unequal, it's dominated by this small group of, you know, private school, university educated people, and they've got to brainwash the rest of the population. And what they do is they use the ideological state apparatus, they use things to try and brainwash the ordinary people into not realising that they're in such an unequal position in society. So when Marx came up with Marxism back in the 1840s, For him, it was religion. So he famously said, religion is the opium of the masses. Okay, he said that religion is used by governments to kind of delude people who are poor into thinking it's okay, it doesn't really matter because you're going to go to heaven after you die, and to dull the pain of their existence. So he said this was used as an ideological state apparatus to brainwash the poor into accepting their position in society. Now, if we move that forward to the 21st century, we could say that maybe the religion isn't as important today. But Marxists would argue that it's replaced by the media. Okay, the media play that role of brainwashing. So we mentioned, didn't we, in this sort of Bullingdon group here, we've got the wealthy politicians, we've also got journalists. Okay, so Jonathan Ford of the FT, okay, is a member of this group. And the argument is that the media is used to kind of brainwash people to accept their unequal position in society. Okay? And if we look at the ties in the Bullingdon Club, we can see those ties even more clearly. Anyone know any of these people on the board here? Go on, Ellie.
Tony Blair?
Yeah, good. So we've got Tony Blair here. Anyone know anyone else?
Cameron?
Yeah, David Cameron. Anyone know this guy? He's very important. So this is Rupert Murdoch. Okay, so he owns News International, one of the largest media corporations. This is a lady called Rebecca Brooks. Anyone know who she is?
Well, she do like News of the World editor and all that.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So she was the editor of the News of the World at the time that there was a kind of major phone hacking scandal. And she got fired from that, but after she was fired from it, she had like a big 1-hour conversation with Tony Blair about how he could maybe support her with that. There's a lot of interlocking here between them, okay? So I think Brown and Blair were both present at her wedding. Okay, so lots of really tight relationships between these groups. And there's an idea, therefore, that these groups are working together as part of this ideological state apparatus for Marxists to kind of brainwash the poor and keep them in their positions in society. And in fact, there's a writer called Owen Jones, okay, who's quite a left-wing writer, who's written a lot about how all of these people are united in an organisation called the Establishment, and they work together to kind of brainwash and keep people unaware of the inequality that they face in society. Okay, so if you think back to that portrayal of chavs we looked at in Little Britain, that would be an instance of that, this idea that the media is kind of ridiculing poor people and portraying them as lazy and feckless and so forth. Now, alongside what's called the ideological state apparatus, Marxists would also say another way in which inequality is maintained and the poor are kept at the base of society is what they call the RSA, okay, or the repressive state apparatus. So this is the idea that the law courts are also loaded against poor people. Okay, so within law, we mentioned Ewan Ferguson here, okay, one of the Bullingdon boys, top lawyer, a partner in a London law firm called Herbert Smith. The idea is that all of these wealthy lawyers are working together, again, to keep the poor in their position at the base of society. So again, to give you some ideas, or some ideas of how Marxists would argue that this repressive state apparatus works, they would say that poor people that commit crimes of poverty, like burglary, tend to get imprisoned and put away for a long time. They would say wealthy people, so for instance Volkswagen, that commit crimes that are far more damaging, so Volkswagen were accused of cheating emissions in order to allow their cars to pollute the environment more, something which has been linked not specifically Volkswagen but to up to 40,000 deaths every year. Nobody was sent to prison for that. So let's say again, the RSA, the legal system, is loaded. It punishes the poor, but it forgives the rich, okay? And if we look at that, guys, I just want to focus in on the police as well. They would also argue that this is loaded not just against the poor, but also against ethnic minorities, to throw something else in. So I'm going to show you a little clip from a documentary called The Secret Policeman. And what happened in this basically was that this journalist went undercover in the police service, I think in Manchester or Warrington, so quite local, and he posed as a policeman, and he spoke to local police officers, and he found that there were some really kind of shocking racist attitudes. So I'm just going to play you 30 seconds or so of this. You are going to see some shocking and quite racist language in it. But again, this is the idea that society is unequal because the law, courts, the police are biased against the poor, but also against ethnic minorities, and particularly Asians in this instance.
5 years ago, I infiltrated Greater Manchester Police to investigate racism. What I found really did shock the nation.
A dog was born in a barn is still a dog. A Paki born in Britain is still Paki.
He's a Paki, I'm stopping. He's all English.
I class them as one thing and that's it. Pakis.
As a result of my film, 10 officers from 3 different forces were forced to resign, a further 12 were disciplined, and 3 police trainers were removed.
I felt physically sick as I watched the secret police.
So it's quite shocking, ladies and gents, but it's another dimension of that argument about whether we live in a fair society or not. Okay, the argument that there is this repressive state apparatus of law, courts, and police, which is which works against the poor, but also works against ethnic minorities. And I'm going to introduce another kind of dimension, another question about the idea of fairness and equality here, which focuses around this woman. Does anyone know who this is? She's a very famous kind of 20th century thinker. Any ideas, ladies? So she's a French philosopher, seen by many as the kind of founding mother of feminism, called Simone de Beauvoir. Okay, and she was working in France, writing in France in the 1940s, 1950s. So she's in a relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre, if you ever heard of him. Okay, and she basically argued that society was unfair, okay, and it was unequal. But the real equality wasn't to do with ethnicity. It wasn't to do with wealth and social class between the upper class and the middle class. She said it was to do with what she called a sex class, okay? And by that she meant the real kind of oppressed group was the sex class of women. It was gender inequality, okay? This is the major issue. And this is one of the sort of final ideas I want to think about, guys, okay? So she said this quote, so l'homme est défini comme un être humain. Okay, full French accent. Une femme comme une femelle, chaque fois qu'elle se comporte comme un être humain, on dit qu'elle imite le mal. Does anyone want to have a go at translating now? Go on, Oliver.
Man is defined as a human being and the woman's a female. Each time she behaves as a human being, we say that she's imitating the male.
Yeah, superb, okay. So she basically said that women are considered as inferior versions of men. Men are what are defined as humanity, and women are defined as the other, okay? And she said this was the kind of underlying way that people thought. And she came up with a couple of examples. So she gave a quote from Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. He talked about women. He said they were female by virtue of a certain lack of qualities, okay? So he said women were defined by the fact that they lacked the qualities of men. St. Thomas defined women as imperfect men. So she said that women were basically defined as inferior to men and as the other from men, okay? And that this underlay what she called patriarchy. And patriarchy is the idea, the concept that within society, men dominate women. So for here, this was the real inequality. And I want to build on that with a couple of more recent ideas, okay? So later 20th century feminist thinkers have focused particularly on kind of childhood toys as something that's led before this. You might have heard of this. So over here are some stereotypical girls' toys. Over here some stereotypical boys' toys. Anyone like to put their hand up and tell me, what they remember playing with as a child, what their favourite toy was as a child? Go on, Josh.
Cars and construction sites.
Good, that's the correct answer, yeah. So cars and construction toys. Any girls here play with kind of dolls and stuff? Hands up if you play with dolls when you're little girls. Hands up if you still play with dolls now. Right. Any boys play with dolls when they were younger? Ariel? Yeah, good, okay. What about a kind of Lego and Mechano and construction toys? So boys that play with their construction toys, like Josh over here. Girls that play with construction toys? Good, yeah. So there's an argument, guys, that these sort of inequalities that develop also develop to do with what we call in sociology primary socialisation. And there's a sociologist called Anne Oakley, so a feminist, and she wrote that the reason why we have inequalities is because from a very young age, women are challenged, or girls are challenged by these toys, into the idea that what's important for them is being mothers, okay, so, playing with dolls, or cooking, so kitchen sets, or being attractive to men, okay, so, dressing up toys, makeup sets and these kind of things. Whereas boys are challenged into the idea that what's important is that they go out, they do things, okay, that they build things. And those ideas haven't really changed much since the 1950s, so this is a kind of very modern toy advertisement. This is an advertisement from the 1950s where we got mum and daughter around the fridge, okay. It's quite an interesting fact, actually, that the association of pink with femininity only really originates in the 1950s, okay? So, but there's this idea that people have been challenged into these ideas from quite young. And this comes from this feminist thinker, Anne Oakley, okay? So Anne Oakley did a lot of research with housewives, and she spoke to them about their experiences. So she'd spend a day with a housewife, she'd help the housewife with her chores around the home, okay, get to know them really well, and have a chat with them, and find out about, why they'd got into that role, what they thought of that particular role. And Oakley came up with this thing. She said that women are being channeled into this idea that what's natural for them is to be a mother. And that's because that's what works for society. So she said society has a tremendous stake in insisting on a woman's natural fitness for the career of mother because all of the alternatives are too expensive. So society is directly, deliberately challenging girls from a young age into this idea that this is what's important for them. Now there's some sociologists that built on that, and I apologise for the language here. So this is Fran Ansley. She's a sociologist that's combined the inequality relating to women with an inequality on the basis of class. So she said women are being encouraged to be homemakers and to look after children and to cook, but they're being encouraged as well because that's a way of keeping the poor man in his position, okay? Because the poor man is frustrated by the capitalist system, and what does he do? Well, he comes home and he shouts at his wife and he takes his frustrations out on his wife, okay? Or he comes home and he beats up his wife. And this enables the young man, the poor man, to vent his frustration on the woman rather than turning against the system, okay? So for some thinkers, these kind of unfairness in terms of gender and class can be linked together. But let's think of some of the counter arguments though, okay? So liberal feminists would say actually there's been a lot of progress in terms of equality for women, okay? So they'd point to things like the 1970 Equal Pay Act, okay? So the fact that it's now illegal to pay men more than women for the same job. They point to girls' achievement over boys in education, so your year, okay, at GCSE in 2017, not just your year, nationally, I think girls, about 70% of girls got C grades at GCSE, whereas only about 60% of boys, so they point to the fact that girls are doing much better than boys in school. They point to the fact that more girls are going on to university than boys are, more girls are going on to medicine, law, all these kind of things that boys were. They point to people like Theresa May, the Prime Minister, and say, actually, this is evidence that we've come a long way and that, you know, women have got every opportunity that men have these days. Back to our functionist guys, they say, well, yeah, there is a difference, but that's a good thing. Remember that idea that, you know, the different parts of the body, men need to be doing the work, women need to be looking after children because women are like the heart of society, men are like the kind of muscles of society. Now, linking onto that, guys, so this final idea is the idea of social action, okay? So again, this is a sociological theory that's quite old, but it basically says, irrespective of your class or your gender or your ethnicity, today in the 21st century, we all have freedom of choice. We can choose to be whatever we want to be, okay? So if you're a woman and you want to go out and work and become like a top engineer, you can do it. If you're a man and you want to stay at home and look after the children, you can do that. They say we've got freedom of choice today. Anyone recognise this individual? So you'll all have heard of her. She's the best-selling author in Britain today. Yeah, it's J.K. Rowling. Okay, so J.K. Rowling is seen as, you know, kind of evidence for this because she came from, you know, a relatively poor background. She was a single mother, wasn't she? And she wrote her books while living on benefits. And there was this kind of rag to riches story, how she's now the 197th richest person in UK, massive personal fortune, I think kind of £238 million. So this idea that people can come from, you know, a poor background or a female background and achieve massively. Any ideas who this is? Yeah, so this is Alan Sugar, okay? And again, he could be pointed to as an example of this, okay? So a man that came from a pretty poor background, okay? So when he was young, he lived in a council flat, started off just earning money, working on his father's greengrocer, came from a poor area of London, and yet has become one of the wealthiest people in Britain today. So a personal fortune of £1.15 billion, okay? So this is an idea that some people come back with, to argue that actually today we do live in a fair society. These are case studies that show that people have that kind of equality of opportunity. What I've done there, guys, I've just given you sort of a very kind of brief introduction to a number of different sociological theories. Okay, so functionalism, Marxism, feminism, and social action theory. I'd like just to go back to that first question. So, do we live in a fair society? So, get hands up if you think we do. Okay. And then the final thing. Out of those four theories, those four ideas, okay, so functionalism, the idea we live in a fair meritocratic society. Social action, we live in a fair society because we can choose what our fortune is going to be, irrespective of our beginnings. Marxism, actually society is unfair because it's loaded against the poor. Or feminism, we live in an unfair society because females don't have the same opportunities as men. I'd like to have a think about that, guys, and go to the corner of the room that represents your point of view. So if you think functionalism, by the chairs over here. If you think social action, over in this corner. If you think Marxism, back corner over there by Mr. Christo. If you think feminism, so it's unequal in terms of gender, back over there by Yannick, guys. Right. So if you just get up and just move to the corner of the room. Yeah. Sorry, Mr. Christo.
Beautiful. I think most people would agree that life itself is inherently unfair. There is nothing fair about life whatsoever. So, is it up to us as rational, conscious beings to impose that fairness on top of life or not? Because I think that's what this question is all about. You know, I don't believe that anything's fair about anything. It's just built into nature. But should we be trying to impose a sort of a sense of fairness in society?
Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I mean, personally, I would say we're never going to achieve it, but yes, we should attempt to sort of minimise those differences, certainly in terms of equality of opportunity. But that's just my opinion, I guess. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. You're right that life is unfair. Yeah.
But it keeps people quiet if you impress upon them that it is fair. So if you want to impress your idea that it is fair, then you're not going to get anybody complaining about it.
Do you think you genuinely need to be more fair, though, or just kind of tell people that it's fair?
I think we need to be fair to everybody, and I don't think we are.
Yeah.
But I think if people went away with the impression, which is what Mr. Christo suggested, that things were fair, there wouldn't be any kickback from anybody against it.
Yeah, there's a book which I think I put on, and I didn't put it in a sheet, but there's a book called like The Spirit Level, which suggests that societies that are more fair, and particularly these Scandinavian countries, which we're often talking about, it suggests that in these countries there are lower levels of crime and higher life expectancy, and it ties these all back to equality, which I guess would tie into that. But that's quite an extreme interpretation one way. Guys, have a look at the sheet and have a look at some of the statistics on there, and then if you get up and you move to that corner, okay? Then you may be asked to explain why you're there. Stay on that side of the chair, for health and safety. What safety? That wire is about to trip over and punch you down. Social action is here, yeah. So that's the idea that you can choose your best.
Good. Sisters, join me.
Got a lot of Marxists in the room. Social action is... So this is social action, yeah? Yeah, you're a functionalist? Functionalist, Ariel? Yeah? Feminists? Marxists? Yeah? Would anyone like to just start off and tell me why you're in that corner? So why you agree with the Marxist or the functionalist or the feminist or the social action theory? Anyone like to? Go on, Ellie.
I think, despite the fact that I think gender inequality is a big issue, I think the kind of idea of class mobility is still developing and still isn't where it needs to be. And I think what you were saying before about how only 7% of the population go to these private and public schools, and yet there's a huge amount of people who have these high positions in government, in media, in things like that, who come from those places, shows that class mobility is not quite where it needs to be.
So would you say like it's better to be a rich woman than a poor man?
I think gender is also an issue, but I think that class is more of an issue at the moment.
Okay. So Ellie's definitely saying inequality and society's unfair, yeah? So that's fair enough, yeah? Ariel, you'd disagree with that, I guess?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because in the world we live in, businesses are motivated solely by profit, not by gender or class or whatever. So if someone, whether it be a man or a woman or a certain ethnic minority or whatever, can offer them that profit because they've got the necessary skills, then they're going to take that.
Okay, so that's going to override these things. Anyone like to come in from a feminist point of view? So Emily or Faye or Mr. Marvin?
Well, in society, women can't reach those positions. Like, as much as we try to have equality, men will just get the top positions. There's only been yeah, there's a female Prime Minister, but how many female Prime Ministers have there been?
So you'd say this argument that because it's all about money, kind of business and society is gender blind, you'd say that that's not correct because we can say there's only been like 2 female Prime Ministers, there's still very few kind of like FTSE top 200 or whatever it is companies that are run by women, so you'd say that still limits people, yeah? Yeah, Ellie?
I'm wondering if I can also make a point in defence of that as well, which is that even though, you know, attitudes towards women being in high positions have changed and are changing, there's still a huge inequality in terms of the way people view women, the way people think they don't seem as authoritative or as capable or as able to have those high positions, or they think if they are in those positions they need more help to be there, and so there is still that inequality. People feel more secure putting men in those positions of power.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the media, I know I was talking about the media in terms of class. There was an infamous like story, wasn't there, or cover last year, I think it was on The Sun, where it was like May and Merkel negotiating, and they were kind of discussing who had the best legs, and the point would be, well, that wouldn't be done if it was, you know, David Cameron and Francois Hollande negotiating. So there's that idea, isn't there, that, you know, women are still judged in that way. Yeah, good, go Charlotte.
Also, to add on to Ellie's point, I think it takes place when, let's say, Theresa May displays strength, or for what people understand. People will call that bossy, whereas if a male Prime Minister will do exactly the same thing, it's more likely that they'll be called a powerful leader or confident, there is a huge difference with that, and I think that demonstrates the importance.
Excellent. Where do you think that comes from? Do you think that's from the media, or do you think that's just what, you know, what we take in our kind of socialisation, the way we view people?
Yeah,
or?
I think it's part of upbringing, particularly in that generation. Obviously they try and prevent that now, but it still takes place.
Yeah, excellent. Anyone like to come in from a social action perspective on why? Go on, Amy.
I think it's hard to pigeonhole society in any one of these categories, but within reading for the social action argument, that if a person has the skills and the determination to get where they want to go, then that has been proven to be successful. I'll ensure they're not given.
Yeah, good. And that's interesting because you brought in there like a postmodernist argument. You're saying it's hard to pigeonhole people today, so you could argue in the 21st century, actually, you know, the idea of gender roles no longer applies because people can, you know, switch gender, can't they? I mean, people can physically switch gender. You could say, well, how far does class system, which Marx thinks about back in the 1850s, how far does that apply in 2018? Okay, so yeah, good. Any other views or any other questions, guys? Go on, Oliver.
I'd say I'd call between Marxism and social action because
that's an interesting combination. Yeah.
It is possible for anyone, if they work hard enough, to advance their position, but some groups are disadvantaged because of class, race or gender, and it's a lot more difficult for them to progress because they've got factors that they don't control stacked against them.
Do you think then, like, against play devil's advocate, do you think it's possible for someone to come from like an underclass background and become Prime Minister?
Yeah, but it's less likely than a person coming from a privileged background because they don't have the same education or opportunities.
Has it ever happened? I can't think. Would you, Mr. Marvin, would you say anyone? Like John Major, he's not really underclass.
John Major is from humble stock.
Yeah.
I think he was one of the first non-Etonian Prime Ministers, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So yeah, he is I think the first recognisable Prime Minister from less prestigious stock.
Go on, Aaron.
In response to the comments, surely if a business wants to, as I said, make profit, and if it's true that the gender pay gap is so large, for £1 for men for every 72 pence for women, or whatever it is, then why don't all businesses hire all women so they can pay them less than women?
That's illegal.
What do you mean it's illegal?
Because they have to pay women the same rate as men, so you can just hire all women and pay them less than you would have.
Yeah, but exactly, it is illegal. That's why I'm saying the gender pay gap is nowhere near as it claims. Otherwise, if businesses thought they could pay women less than men, then they'd be hiring more women. So profits will be made.
Anyone else got any points on why they're there, or anyone want to raise anything else? Go on, Eddie.
I would like also say that if you want to go full Marxism, it's it's kind of the idea that class in itself is flawed, and that we need to kind of uproot the system and replace it with a system of complete equality, where it's not about class mobility, it's about not having class at all, because that is inherently going to be damaging. And so I think that, I mean, I'm not arguing for that, but I'm saying it's an interesting idea that, you know, if class didn't exist, then there would be, you know, the possibility of people popping up from everywhere to do things, and not that there would be the same kind of positions available, but it's that kind of concept that it wouldn't be based on a hierarchy.
Yeah, and for Marxists, it's, you know, this which is stopping that from happening, isn't it? It's the fact that, you know, politicians and the media are kind of brainwashing the working class, and the police and the law courts are keeping them down to stop that from happening. Right, guys, if anyone's got any questions, do feel free to stay back at the end. I'd add on to the bottom of the sheet just a few little pieces of reading, if that's something that interests you. Hopefully you found it interesting. Hopefully you can see the links to your subjects and think a little bit more broadly. Thank you very much, guys. You've been excellent.